Okay, welcome to the second video. So we're just going to continue on with our Python tutorial. Here's our Colab project that you should have up and running when you're watching the video. Again, feel free to watch the video once through and then come back, but I really think it's useful to watch the video and code at the same time. You might have to pause, etc. Okay, here we go.
38 years old. So this is how the int function works. Now we also have another built-in function called float. That is for converting a value to a floating point number. A floating point number in Python and other programming languages is a number with a decimal point. So 10 is an integer and 10.1 is a float. So we have int, we have float, and we also have bool for converting a value to a boolean. And finally we have stir for converting a value to a string. So these are the built-in functions for converting the type of our variables. Now here's a little exercise for you. I want you to write a basic calculator program. So here we have to enter two numbers. We can type a whole number or a number with a decimal point. And then our program will print the sum of these two numbers. So pause the video, spend 2 minutes on this exercise, and then see my solution.
Okay, so again, like he says, you pause the video. You're going to do that in Colab. And so the way that you would do that is that you would come over here and get another code block, right? Another code cell or block here. You can, of course, just add it to this one if you like by just pushing carriage return and keep going. But it's cleaner to add in a code block. I would also suggest that you put a text cell in between the two, saying this is your second exercise, can't spell, and I like to make that bold. And then I'm going to say simple calculator only does plus. Okay, so that's what I would put in. And then come down here and get your code block and start writing the code. Now you should know how to do this now, but give it a try before you look at the solution, okay? You might have to scroll back in the video a little bit. You might have to look up here again to remind yourself what to do. Give that a try. Pause the video, give that a try. Okay, I'll give you a second to pause. And we're back. Okay.
All right, first we're going to call our input function to read the first number. We get the result and store it in a variable called first. Now, let's declare another variable called second and read the second number. Now, we calculate the sum, so that is first plus second. Now let's see what happens when we print sum on the terminal. So I enter 10 and 20. But instead of 30, we get 1020. This is because we're combining or concatenating two strings. So, as I told you before, the input function returns a string. So, this line will be equivalent to first equals 10. You're dealing with a string, not an integer. Similarly, second is going to be 20 as a string. So when we combine two strings, 10 plus 20, we'll get 1020 because we're dealing with textual data, okay? So to solve this problem, we need to convert the values we read to their numeric representation. So over here, we're going to pass first to our int function and here as well. Now let's run our program. So we enter 10 and 20, we get 30. What if we enter a floating point number? So 10.1 and 20. You got an error. So to solve this problem, we need to treat both these values as floats. So instead of the int function, we're going to use the float function. Now, let's run our program one more time. We enter a whole number and a floating point number. So the result is correct. Now, let's add a label over here. So sum is plus sum. Let's run our program. One more time, 10 and 20. Once again, we got an error. The error is saying that Python can only concatenate strings, not floats to strings. So on line 4, we have a string. We're concatenating this with a float because the result of this expression is a floating point number. You're adding 2 floats, so the result is a float as well. So Python doesn't know how to evaluate code like this. It doesn't know how to concatenate a float to a string. To solve this problem, we need to convert sum to a string. So this is where we use the stir function. Now, let's run the program again. So 10 plus 20.1, and here's the result. And one last thing. In this example, I'm calling the float function. At the time, we want to calculate the sum of these 2 numbers, but this is not a requirement. We can call the float function over here. So this input function returns a string. We can pass that string to our float function. Take a look. So float, parentheses, like this. So the value that we're passing to the float function is the value that is returned from the input function. Similarly, we call the float function over here. Now, we can change this expression to first plus second. That is another way to write this piece of code. So type conversion is important in Python and other programming languages. There are times you need to convert the type of a variable to a different type.
Okay, so he went through a lot of that very fast, but I need you to make sure that you understand all of that. So a lot of this is probably new to you if you've never done coding before, thinking about variables and what types they are, okay? So we have to be careful, like we had in this example, because Python makes, when you have the input function, it inputs things as strings. So when you type when I typed 1965 for what year I was born, it put that into a string variable. So birth year was a string, and that's because computers really store strings in a different way than they do numbers, just because there are different different machine codes for letters and numbers that are considered letters, etc. So you don't really need to know the ins and outs of that. Just remember that you have to be very specific to Python about what you want, right? Do you want something to be a number? Do you want it to be a string? And sometimes Python thinks a number is a string because certain functions like input output a string. So this input function gives back a string, as we saw, and we had to convert it. Excuse me. So one thing to be aware of too is this thing called floating point numbers. It just means a number with a decimal, and instead of making the birth year into integer, I think in general you would just say float for everything, because you don't know. Someone might put in that they're that they were born in the middle of a year or something, right? Somebody may put something in that's not an integer, and you don't want your code to crash just because of that. So in general, I just always used float, almost never use int, because float will work for everything. It'll work for integers, it'll work for floating point numbers with decimals, etc. Okay, so let's go through and write this code just like he's writing here. So we're going to say, I'm going to use a little comment that says inputting the 2 numbers that you would like to add. Now this is just, again, when you start something with a hashtag, Python is not going to try to run that line of code because it's not code, it's a comment. And you should always comment your code. Okay, we haven't really talked about comments, but in general, when you're writing a little code, and again, in this class, you're really not going to be writing much code. You're going to be looking at other people's code and maybe modifying that code. When you do a modification to someone else's code, you really should comment, because you want to say, hey, to anyone else who's looking at it, or to yourself later when you're looking at it and you forgot what you did, here's what I did to that code. And a comment is a good thing. Again, in Google Colab, you can also write text like this, but this is really sort of embedded in the code. You can stick it at the end of a line. We're going to do that here when we do that. We do this. Okay, so let's do it. So first we're going to type the name of the first variable first, and then this is equal to float, float, and then input, and then what we want, enter, I'm just putting my own prompt here, the first number you want to add. Okay, and then I'll put a colon, and then I'll put a space, maybe 2 spaces. There we go. And I've got to make sure I have 2 parentheses. And notice what this editor does, right? What Colab does. It puts little boxes around the 2 parentheses that match. So this one here matches this first one, and this one here matches this second one. So we got to make sure we're closing it. Remember that input, when you put a number in here like 2.5, right? When you, the user, are putting that in, input's going to return a string, and then float's going to convert it to a number, and then everyone will be happy. Okay? And so here I can say with a little comment, first number to add, or I can say something like convert number string to floating number, float number, not floating, float to number. Okay? So that, again, is a comment that's kind of in line with the code. It tells you what that line is doing. Some people like to code everything, like to comment on every line. It's a good habit. So whatever you like to do, but you should put in comments whenever you're changing code or writing code. Okay, input, and now please, or just enter the second number you want to add. Oops. There we go. And yeah, I'll leave that comment off. All right, and now we're going to calculate the sum. Sum is equal to first plus second. And then we'll print. Oops. Print the sum of your 2 numbers is, and we're going to add, remember string concatenate, you're converting now the sum back to a string, right? So we had to convert our inputs into strings, and now we're converting the sum, which is now a number, right? So sum is a number before you convert it. We're converting it to a string so that print can use it. All right, now we need another parenthesis. There we go. And you can see now we have 2 matching parentheses here. Okay, good. All right, so let's run this and see what happens. Got to enter a first number. And let's see, what does it give me? The sum of your 2 numbers is 6. Perfect. Okay. And I'll put a little comment in here just to remind everybody that I had to convert sum back to string. Well, it was never a string. How about just to string? Okay, there we go. All right, so let's keep going.
In this tutorial, I'm going to show you a bunch of cool things you can do with strings in Python. So let's start by declaring a variable called course and set it to Python for beginners. Now this string that we have over here is technically an object. And an object in Python is like an object in the real world. As a metaphor, think of the remote control of your TV. This remote control is an object, and it has a bunch of capabilities. It has a bunch of buttons for turning your TV on, turning it off, changing the volume, and so on. Now in this program, this course variable is storing a string object. This string object has a bunch of capabilities. So if you type course dot, you can see all the capabilities available in a string object. These are basically functions that you can call, just like the print or input functions. The difference is that the print and input functions are general purpose functions. They don't belong to a particular object, but the functions you see over here are specific to strings. Now more accurately, we refer to these as methods. So when a function is part of an object, we refer to that function as a method. So let's look at a few examples. Here we have a function or a method called upper, and we use that to convert a string to uppercase. So if we print course.upper and run this program, you can see our course in uppercase. Pretty useful.
Okay, so just to give you a little bit more of that, let's go down and get another block of text. Okay, so let's do exactly what we were doing before, what he did. So let's put course equals the string Python for beginners, or how about we put it all in lowercase? Python for beginners. Okay, now when he was talking about this being an object, right? So let's run this. All right, so now if we start typing course dot, we'll see all the methods. And over here you can see it says built-in function or method. So because Python knows this is a string, because you put something in there that looks like a string, right? It's got quotes around it. He put single quotes on his, I put double quotes, but remember, you can do either. Because you did that, you made course, a variable that you made up, a string variable, and it comes with these what are called built-in methods, or methods as he was saying. And there's lots of them, right? Capitalize, case fold, center, count, all kinds of stuff. And let's look, and you can see there's a drag bar here. You can look at this, many, and you can imagine what all these do. So there's really kind of lots of cool things. Some of them are really easy to tell what they might do, and some of them aren't so easy to tell. So for instance, oops, hello, I got rid of my list. What happened to you, list? There's one here, the upper, like he's saying here, upper. And then we need to put these two things around it because it needs these little parentheses around it to call it. So let's say print course.upper. Okay, and let's try. There we go. So it's very cool. There's lots of different things you can do, and you can go and look up built-in methods for strings in Python and see what you get. There's lots of cool things that you can do. So let's take a look. Keep going.
Now, what you need to understand here is that this upper method does not change our original string. It will return a new string. So right after this, if we print course, you can see that our course variable is not affected. So the upper method returns a new string. Now, similarly, we have another method called lower for converting a string to lowercase. We have a method called find to see if our string contains a character or a sequence of characters. For example, here we can pass y, and this will return the index of the first occurrence of y in our string. So in Python, the index of the first character in a string is 0. So here we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So when we run this program, we're going to see 1 on the terminal because the index of y is 1. Take a look. First, I'm going to delete this line. We don't need it anymore. Also, let's delete this line. Let's run the program. There you go. Now, as I told you before, Python is sensitive to lowercase and uppercase letters. So if I pass an uppercase y here, this find method returns -1 because we don't have an uppercase y in this string. We can also pass a sequence of characters, for example, 4. So this will return the index of the word 4. Take a look. So it's 7. Now, there are times we want to replace something in a string with something else. To do that, we use the replace method. Replace. So we can replace 4 with a string containing the number 4. Take a look. So Python for beginners. Obviously, if we look for a character or a sequence of characters that don't exist in our string, nothing is going to happen. For example, if we try to replace x with 4, obviously we don't have x here, so nothing is going to happen. Also, just like the upper method, the replace method is not going to modify our original string, so it's going to return a new string. This is because strings in Python and many other programming languages are immutable. We cannot change them once we create them. Whenever we want to change a string, we'll end up with a new string object in memory. Now, one last thing I want to cover in this tutorial. There are times you want to see if your string contains a character or a sequence of characters. One way to do that is using the find method that we talked about. So let's see if our string contains Python. Now, when we run this program, that is the index of the first occurrence of the word Python in our string. Now, in Python, we can also use the in operator. So we can write an expression like this. We type a string, Python, then we type in. This is a special keyword in Python. This is what we call the in operator. So after that, we type the name of our variable. So with this expression, we're checking to see if we have Python in course. As you can see, Python code is very readable. It's like plain English. So when we run this program, instead of seeing the index of the first occurrence of Python, we see a Boolean value. This is more desirable in a lot of cases. Next, we're going to look at arithmetic operations.
Okay, so that's a lot to unpack. All right, let's try that. So the idea here is that, like we said before, there's lots of these methods to use on strings, and you can find them by just start typing course dot again, like we saw before. And we saw this find, right? So it's find is in here somewhere. Let's go and find it. Of course, you can just type find, but I want to show you where it is. Here it is. So we have find, and then we're going to find the word Python, right? Now notice I put lowercase because Python in my string course is in lowercase, right? Okay, so let's run this and see what happens. Now remember, it's going to give me the index. So index just means position, right? It's the position in the string of the word Python. And it doesn't give me where Python starts and where it ends, right? It just says here, hey, here's the beginning of the word Python, okay? It starts at index 0. So index 0 is the P, index 1 is the Y, index 2 is the T, etc. And even the space has an index, right? So if we come in here and we say, hey, can you please find me my spaces? See if that works. Okay. Well, the first space that it finds is in index 6. So P1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, sorry. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Indeed, right? Okay. And we'll talk later about how you find all the spaces, etc. Okay. And then the replace function is very interesting and fun because you can use it to replace stuff in your string. So let's do that. Course dot replace. There it is. And we're going to give it what we want to replace. Like I liked his idea of replacing 4 with, and you've got to put a comma, with what you want to replace it with. Now I want you to point out that these nice little things pop up when you're trying to use something, and these are the documentation about that particular method. So for instance, it's telling you this is course.replace, and in general it's any string can use this replace function, and how you call it is you give it what the old thing you want to replace, the new thing with a comma, and then the new thing that you want to replace it with, and then other things which you don't care about. The brackets here mean that this is an unnecessary argument, that you could use it if you need it. I don't really know what count is. I have to go read the rest of the documentation, but the fact that it's in square brackets means I don't need it. I can run this thing without anything that's inside the square brackets, but I have to have something that I want to be replaced and the something that I want to replace it with. Otherwise, this method will give me an error. So let's read what it says. Return a copy of the string with all occurrences of a substring old replaced by new. Notice it said all occurrences. So it's going to find all instances of the word for in our string. There's only one of them. And it's going to replace it with whatever we put in, which we haven't put anything yet. If the optional argument count, so it's optional, that's why the brackets, is given, only the first count occurrences are replaced. So what does that mean? It means that I could put 1 here, and it would only replace 1, the first one, when it found 4, right? So notice we have spaces, and we're gonna use that in a second. But if I only want the first space replaced with something, I would put 1 here, right? I don't want all of them. Let's say I just wanted 1. Or I could leave it blank to get all of them. So that's really flexible, but you don't need this count. And when you see this documentation with the square brackets, it means you don't have to have that thing for it to run. All right, so let's try, what do we want to replace it? Let's do what he did. We'll replace it with the string 4, okay? All right, let's go. Yep, there we go. And notice that it's actually printing it for us. I don't know if you've noticed that, but it is printing the output of course.replace without using a print function. So you might be like, wait a minute, well, why is that the case? If we look back in the video here, right, he is printing this out. It is because Google Colab is a different editor than what he's using, and it automatically, and in some cases, not all cases, will print out something. So in the replace method, it will actually print it out, okay? So we printed course.upper, which is here, but the replacement actually printed it out for you already without having used the print function. So be aware that you may not need print in Google Colab for certain things. All right, let's do what we were going to do before. I'm going to replace this with, I got to put a space in, and I'm going to replace all this spaces with a giant X, okay? All right, let's see what happens. There we go, the spaces are replaced with a giant X. Notice that all of them got replaced, right? There was 2 of them, and this method replaces all. All right, now what if I use my optional count and I just want the first one replaced? Okay, let's see. And there we go, only the first replaced. Only the first space was replaced with a big X. Okay, I hope that's getting it clear a little bit. Let's keep going on the video. I rolled it back a little bit.
With a new string object in memory. Now, one last thing I want to cover in this tutorial. There are times you want to see if your string contains a character or a sequence of characters. One way to do that is using the find method that we talked about. So let's see if our string contains Python. Now, when we run this program, that is the index of the first occurrence of the word Python in our string. Now, in Python, we can also use the in operator. So we can write an expression like this. We type a string, Python, then we type in. This is a special keyword in Python. This is what we call the in operator. So after that, we type the name of our variable. So with this expression, you're checking to see if we have Python in course. As you can see, Python code is very readable. It's like plain English. So when we run this program, instead of seeing the index of the first occurrence of Python, we see a Boolean value. This is more desirable in a lot of cases.
Okay, let's go over that. So let's just go down here, and we're going to use this again. So I'm going to say string Python in. See, look, it's king you. Hey, that's good. That's a keyword, right? In. And notice the color changed by the editor, so that lets you know that's not just the word in, it is a special operator. In my course. Yeah, course? All right, sure. Okay, so I'm going to now run it. And I got true. Now notice that my printout of the replace got replaced, right? There's nothing here. And that's because in Google Colab, the last thing that you run is going to show up in the output. So again, remember we talked about sometimes you don't need the print, but in this case, I actually have to tell it to print. If I want all these to print, because I just added another piece of code at the end. So if you want output, just keep the print if you are going to do any other code after. Print. Okay. And there, now I got all my printouts, and let's see what happens. There we go, I got a 6 for finding the space. I got a Python X for beginners, when I replaced my first space with an X. And then I got a true for is Python in the course. Okay, all right. So is Python in the course. So notice the difference here that if we said find Python, and I'm going to put that back here, Python, and now I push, I'll get the index of Python, right, like we talked about. But this is actually just saying true or false, is it in there? And again, he's right. It's very useful to just know whether it's there or not. Okay, say you're like, trying to sort through a bunch of names of students to see if, to see the grade of some student in a big spreadsheet or something that you're reading in. You would want to just say, put the name in the, put the name of the student, and then and then whatever your variable that's carrying all of the data is, right? And that way it'll say yes or no if the student is in your data. All right. Okay, let's keep going. Actually, let's take a break here and we'll go on to the next video after this.